Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. Just going to wait a few more seconds to let everyone come in from the waiting room and then we'll get started. Okay, so again, hi, I'm Judy. I'm the Executive Director of F.E.A.S.T, and we're really happy to have you with us here today. Just a few quick housekeeping rules. We ask that you stay muted, that you keep your cameras off through the entire webinar. And if you have questions, as the presenters are talking and you have questions, you can just drop them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. And now I'm going to introduce our two speakers. We're lucky when we have a 2-for-1 today. So Dr. Ross Crosby is a researcher and biostatistician with more than 30 years experience in eating disorders research. He has published more than 600 peer-reviewed research articles. Millie Plotkin is an informationist for Eating Recovery Center, ERC, and creator of the Eating Disorders Information Gateway. Millie worked at the National Library of Medicine and the National Institutes of Health Library before joining ERC in 2013. Millie has been volunteering in eating disorders advocacy work since 2001 and currently serves on the board of the Academy for Eating Disorders. We are really, really happy to have both of you with us here today, and I'm just going to let you get started now.
How's that? Everybody see that?
Yeah, and thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm excited to be here today. Just a quick outline of what we will be talking about today. We will do brief introductions and then spend a good deal of time first from my perspective and then my co-speaker's perspective about how to find research. We'll talk about evaluating research and give you some tips about what research to pay attention to, what studies you may pay less attention to, and we will address any questions you have at the end. And we're hoping there will be lots of questions, and this will be very interactive. So first about me, as the introduction said, I'm a researcher, and I've got a lot of experience as a researcher. But that's one of the things that you should keep in mind is that my perspective is limited to that of a researcher. I'm a biostatistician and I'm a quantitative researcher. I know a lot about quantitative research, but there is a lot of research, which we would call qualitative research, that I know nothing about. So my comments are basically restricted to quantitative research. Keep in mind as a researcher, typically, when I try to find research, I'm looking at very specific, narrow topics. A point to be made in a peer-reviewed paper, a section to write in a grant, and typically my searches and my interests are very narrow. That may be different from families that are trying to find more general information. So keep that in mind and evaluate my comments like that. Lastly, I'm not a clinician. I'm a peer researcher, and so I've got very limited clinical knowledge also that's likely to be reflected in my comments. In terms of my co-speaker, when I was first invited to give this talk, my initial reaction was, oh my God, they should ask Millie to do this talk. While I know some things, my co-speaker is extremely knowledgeable in this area. I had the great joy to be with her on the AED board of directors for several years and became a great fan of hers. So Millie, please make a few comments.
Thank you so much. I'm very flattered. Hi, everyone. My name is Millie. I realize I look very different from the picture that was sent out. I just changed my hair a couple weeks ago. So my official title is Informationalist. That is a real word. I didn't make it up. And it is used in medical librarianship to refer to someone who has a subject specialty. And my subject specialty is eating disorders. That is pretty much all I look at. Eating Recovery Center does also have a mood and anxiety program. So I've had to learn quite a bit about those as well. But of course, all of you know, there's so many overlaps, so many comorbidities with eating disorders between people who also have depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD. So it really has been useful to learn that information. I am also not a clinician. I don't do research. Well, I do some research myself, but I'm on the research committee for ERC. But I'm also someone who has recovered from an eating disorder. So I come into things with that perspective as well, and understanding what it is like to come into this with just personal experience, wondering how to get care, how to find information. So I hope that Ross and I having those two different perspectives is going to be very useful for all of you. And as he said, please do ask questions.
Thank you, Millie. I'm delighted you're here today. All right, finding research, perspectives from a researcher. When I'm looking for research, I rely heavily on electronic search engines, and three in particular that I have found very useful. And that's the first three up here. PubMed and PubMed Central are sponsored by the National Institutes of Health. They're free to use. Anybody can use them anywhere on the internet. You don't have to be part of a library system to use them. Most of the funded research in NIH is linked up to PubMed and PubMed Central. And so it's a vast amount of information on sponsored, funded research. I don't fully understand the difference between PubMed and PubMed Central, but I do know that in terms of success in trying to find eating disorder research, PubMed has typically been much more user-friendly for me. So if I search my name in PubMed, I get about 95% of my articles to show up. With PubMed Central, I get about half of them. So there's some difference between the two. So my recommendation, if you're going to use one of those two, PubMed is probably the preferred one. Millie, do you actually know the difference between those two?
Well, so PubMed Central is the stuff basically that's been NIH funded, and therefore they're free access articles. PubMed, they don't index every single article that is out there in the medical terms. They have selected which journals they're going to do. But in PubMed Central, because they're federally funded, those articles are required to be free to access. I apologize, I have a cat bothering me. Those are free to access. So often you will see when you go into PubMed, there will be a link to PubMed Central. And if that is a great way of accessing articles without having to go through a paywall and having to pay for things. So that's basically it. That PubMed Central is PubMed is a much larger library, and then PubMed Central is the free stuff.
Great, thank you, Millie. Just a few comments on some of the other ones. PsycInfo is useful, particularly for psychological type articles, and I'll use that on occasion depending upon the specific topic. Science.gov is more science-oriented, the hard sciences. ResearchGate seems to be focused a lot on networking of authors. I get half a dozen emails a week saying, are you a co-author on this paper? So they're somehow trying to link up authors and titles, and that sometimes is useful. And Medline is useful when the topic is more medically oriented. But in terms of my comments, I'm going to stick with PubMed today and show you just a few examples and hints about how to use that. So here is the link to PubMed. You can go on any search engine on the internet, type PubMed, and you're going to get easy access to this. And the basic screen looks like this. This is the first screen you'll see. Notice it's NIH and funded by the National Library of Medicine. Type your searches into this, and I'll give you a couple examples of simple. So searches you can do in PubMed. You can search by author name. So if I type in my name and the format is last name with a space and then initials, and middle initials help. Oftentimes they're narrowed down, and you'll get information based upon the search. And one of the handy things that I see, if you see this graph up here on the left-hand side, it shows you the number of hits on that by year. So you can see my publication started way back in 1990 and go through today. You see a nice dip in the COVID range there. But searching by name is quite handy if you know the authors that you're looking for. You can also search by topic. Here I've typed in anorexia nervosa treatment adolescent. And again, you'll see lots of articles, the graph of citations with a lot more citations recently than early on, as we would expect. But my recommendation is that if you use PubMed and get to the first screen, there's an advanced feature right here that I've circled. Go to that. The benefit of that is you can combine searches and better refine your searches. So you can control, if you see this all fields, you can search any fields. You can search abstract, title of the article, authors, text, institutions, dates, a variety of things. So you can control what fields and then the content that you're looking for. And so in my search here, I started out by searching for author Crosby RD, and then I clicked this and button and then put in binge eating in any field. So articles that have me as an author, binge eating anywhere in the title, the abstract, the text, and then negative affect. So I added a third search term. And if we search that, it'll show all the articles that meet these three criteria. It's a topic that our research group is focused on a lot. So we'll get 62 articles that meet those criteria. And you can see if you look at the articles, it'll highlight where the search terms are. So negative affect, binge eating, my name. There will be some where only one of those will appear or two, but you can control that. When you do a search, pay attention to the left-hand buttons over here. And I want to highlight just a few that are extremely useful. If you're looking to get copies of articles, you can use those two buttons over here, free full text or full text, and find articles where you can get the entire article. It's typically not a PDF copy as it would appear in the journal, but it's formatted nicely enough where you get all the materials, all the tables, all the graphs, all the text. So pay attention to that. Also notice that some articles, when they come, have free PMC article. So if you click on that, you'll get a full text version of the article as well. It's a great way of getting full articles without having to go through a big library system. And I know Millie's going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, about how to get articles. Other things to pay attention to, and I'm going to come back to this point about how can we tell good quality articles? How do we know if it's an article that we should pay attention to? Well, one of the things that we have in research is types of articles and how much weight they carry in terms of empirical evidence. At the very top of the food chain in terms of articles that one should pay attention to are meta-analyses, and that's circled right down here. So you can limit your search to meta-analysis. For those of you that don't know what a meta-analysis is, it's a type of review study where a particular paper is focusing on studies that address very similar questions. So a question might be, is cognitive behavioral therapy useful for the treatment of anorexia? A meta-analysis will go in, identify studies that have run quantitative research on that. For each study that they find, they will get an estimate of the direction of their findings and the strength of their findings, take into account the sample size of the study, so they get an overall estimate for each study, combine that information to a single overall estimate so that they, based upon the studies they're reviewing, they can get a quantitative estimate of, does cognitive behavioral therapy, is it effective in the treatment of anorexia? The beauty of a meta-analysis is when the studies being reviewed are relatively small, none of the studies may have positive results, but by combining the results together, sometimes meta-analyses will reveal answers that are inconsistent with the individual conclusions of each article. So very powerful information. You should definitely pay attention to meta-analyses. I haven't circled it, but right underneath meta-analyses, randomized controlled trials are like the second level down in terms of studies that you should pay attention to. Typically, these are studies that have randomized people to one condition or another. Oftentimes, the people don't know what particular condition they're in, if, for example, if it's a drug trial. So very unbiased estimates of the true effect based on randomized clinical trials. You should definitely pay attention to those. A little lower in terms of quality of studies, but very useful for identifying research, are the review papers. The systematic review, which typically has got a very structured search to it, and then general reviews or narrative reviews, which are less formalized, but still useful in terms of providing summaries of topics and identifying literature that's relevant to those topics. So pay attention to those side points. Tips in terms of finding research. My recommendation would be to focus on more recent articles. The reason being, those recent articles are probably likely to cite the most important information. And so typically what you can do is start with those recent articles, look at the citations that they provide and the literature that they summarize, go back to those papers, and sort of work your way backwards. And it makes it a lot easier if you start with relatively recent articles. Advice I give our trainees and graduate students and postdocs is don't rely on the abstract, get the full text of the article, and make sure that you read not just the abstract, but a little bit about the methods to understand what's being done and the conclusions. Oftentimes, abstracts are not true representations of what the paper is actually saying, so make sure that you actually get the paper. As I said, pay attention to the reference section of the papers that you find. They'll be doing a lot of the legwork for you. Prioritize meta-analyses, randomized clinical trials, reviews, and systematic reviews, and pay attention to the articles that are most frequently cited. And Google Citations is a good search that provides you information about how many times papers have been cited. That's an important metric, and it's a clue that these are probably articles that you want to pay attention to. All right, Millie.
Okay, I'm up. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to be talking about two different things, the Eating Disorders Information Gateway and Google Scholar, which Ross did mention earlier. I'm going to walk you through that for a bit. So the Eating Disorders Information Gateway is entirely of my creation. This is what I do every day, is I add stuff into the information gateway. This is hosted by Eating Recovery Center, where I work. The URL for it is kind of odd looking because it's on a separate platform. So rather than trying to give you a link that you're not going to remember, this is the easiest way to access it. You want to go to the eatingrecoverycenter.com webpage, on the right side, you'll see these different tabs. One of them is professionals. And I think if you hit next, it will circle, there we go, information gateway. So you'll click on that, it will take you to a page that will then give you the link. So I'm sorry, there's a few different steps to get there. We are trying to make a better URL that I can just give to people, but that's in progress. So next slide, please. Okay, this is the opening page that you will see. There's a few different tabs here. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. If you are doing a general search, you can use this search box in a similar way that you would use Google, where you can put things in quotation marks, you can put and. There is also an advanced search, which I will show next. One thing to be aware of is that there are two different levels of access. For people who, as you know, as parents, as family members, for someone whose loved one was just diagnosed, you're feeling very overwhelmed and you just want some basic information, doing a whole scientific search is going to not be helpful. It's going to be too much. It's going to be information overload. And I'm very aware of that. So if you don't have a login, you can get what I call consumer level information. It's about 1,000 resources, which sounds like a lot. It is. But you can still narrow down within that. For instance, if you just want a book to read, you can narrow it by books. If you're looking for you do want some research articles, but they're not super in depth. There's not a specific topic that you need. I do have some in there that are a little bit more basic. But for all of you who've been at this for a while, you are looking for the more in-depth information, you can request an account. So you'll see the red arrow that is pointing to request an account. You just need to click on that box. It'll give you a short form to fill out. You can give as much or as little information. The most important thing is to have a name and an email address in there. One thing I do need to explain is this is not an automated system like a lot of places where you click on this and then within 10 seconds, you get an approval. I have to actually manually go in and approve each account. I've never turned anyone down. It's not a matter of, oh, I'm deciding who gets access. It's just the way that things are set up. So if it's on a weekday during the day, my time, I'm on the East Coast of America, I'll probably be able to respond within a few minutes. If it's an evening or a weekend, it could take a day or two. So I do ask for your patience and I apologize that that's the way this is set up. So next slide, please. So very much like Ross is explaining for PubMed, it's very useful to use the advanced search. As you can see, there's a bunch of different ways you can search. Within here, you can search by an author's name. You can use keywords, which I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about in a moment. You can narrow it by year. You can decide if you want to search within just journals, within electronic articles, books. That's where it says resource type, the very last line. And you can change these. So if you have a bunch of keywords you want to put in, you can actually change all of these rows to say keyword. So I wanted to just show you what this looks like. So I searched for my name, and then it gives you the search results, and it lays all of them out, and you can scroll through these. These are alphabetical. If you would like to change it to be chronological, you can see the year column on the far right, and if you click on that, you can actually change it to a chronological list, but it automatically does it alphabetically. And then you can click on any one of these lines. So next slide, please. This is your search results. So it gives you all of the same information that you would see in PubMed, including the full abstract. All of these authors are clickable. So if you see a name that you're interested in and you want to, instead of going back to the beginning and searching for what else has that person written, you can actually click on one of those names and it will just automatically then go to a search for that person. Also at the bottom right, you can see some of the keywords. Again, those are clickable. So if you wanted to search from here on just ARFID, you can click on that term and it will lead you into a search of that. As for actually accessing the articles, unfortunately, just because of copyright, we've all run into this, most things are behind paywalls. So this is a citation index rather than always being able to give you full text articles. In the links section here, you'll see there's just one link. It says publisher. Most likely that means it's behind a paywall. It's still worth clicking because they might have a particular article as open access. If you see two links that are listed here, it's very likely that one of them is the publisher, but one of them is an open access. So please do check on click on both of those just to take a look. If everything is still behind a paywall, I'm going to, in a few minutes, get to some ways that you can get to things. The next slide, please. Oh, okay, so the keyword browse is another way of searching within here. Especially as you start using the system, you will learn, you can get a better idea of how I've categorized things. Everything in here is about eating disorders. So if you try to put in eating disorders as a search term, it's not going to be helpful. You need to narrow it down. So you can see here, please go in and play around with this. Anything that is in the darker text is an actual keyword. Things that are in parentheses, if it's a different term, I realize this is a little confusing. If it's the same term, it just means that's the main search term. If it has a different terminology, for instance, if it said adolescents and then teenagers was in the parentheses and italics, it means that you can search under teenagers, but adolescents is the preferred term that I'm actually using. Any one of these that you click on, it might narrow it down. For instance, we have populations, and on the left-hand column is a larger term. If you click on that, it will show you these various search terms that are within that. I didn't take a picture of it, a screenshot, but if you clicked under family members, you can see that's one of the headings. It would show you that from there, you can then click on parents, siblings, spouses, offspring. I have a few different things, so you can keep narrowing things down. And as you do this, on the right, it will show you, here's some of the articles or other resources. I chose this because there's a few different types to show you different things that are in here. One is a journal article, one is an actual book, and there are links to Amazon, so you can order books if you want to. And there are electronic articles. So there's a lot of different types of things on here. And then if you click on one of these, it will go to the record, like in the previous page that I showed. So this is a really good way of getting to know the database and doing searches. So I think that's everything I have for this. And I believe I go to Google Scholar next. Yes. So Ross mentioned this. This is a fantastic resource. I use this every single day. It is run by Google. So if that's something that you use for searches all the time, you're going to be very familiar with the general setup that you can start typing a term, and it will give you suggestions of other terms that you can add in, and it will also show you ones that you've previously done. So you can see that recently I was doing a search on gastrointestinal disorders along with eating disorders. So next. So I did a search for Ross. So you can see some of the articles that he has, and it is highlighting the words eating and disorders. I did not put those in quotation marks, so it's treating them separately. You can see that he's a co-author on these articles. Very similar to my database, you can actually click on one of these names and we'll do a broader search for that person. One great use for this is you might be able to get articles for free on here. In the right-hand column, where you can see I have read for free, under that it goes to ResearchGate. And that is an actual, it's going to the PDF. So Ross explained ResearchGate is used for researchers for doing networking. So in order to join, you actually have to prove that you're a published author. However, even if you are not a member, you can often still access articles that people have posted themselves. And it will also sometimes give links to universities where authors have things posted there. So this is great. Go here, look in that right-hand column and see if it has any of those free links. As far as doing further searching, I think I have a few things circled. If you hit next. Okay, so you can narrow it down to time frame. I agree with Ross that looking for things that are recent is very useful. So that's a good way to search for things. You can click on related articles. I like this a lot because if you do this search and it comes up with a long list, especially if you're searching by topic, you might see some of these seem to fit what you're looking for. Some of them don't quite fit. So it's really useful to go to the, to click on this related articles, and that will show you things closer to that particular article. And then you can always hit back and go back to this area. And if you are logged into your Google account, you can save things. It will save that citation. You don't have to have a billion tabs open with several different articles, which I'm sure none of us ever do. And you can create a library, and you'll see in the far right, it says My Library. So anything that you save, you can go there. You're not going to have to take notes. Of course, you can if you want on what articles you're looking at. You can just save all of the citations. It's great for a time saver. I think that was everything I had in there. Yes. Okay, so you found an article that you want. It's behind a paywall. What do? There's a bunch of things you can do. One is check with your public library system. A lot of them have access to databases of journals. You can look on their website. You can also just go into the library and ask them, hey, I'm trying to find this article. Is this something that you have access to? If you're looking for a book, and actually even sometimes articles, and you've gone into the catalog and they don't have it, it's still worth asking the librarian, because most libraries participate in what is called interlibrary loan. And they will be able to ask other library systems in the area if they have access, and they might be able to get it on loan to their system and then in turn loan it to you. So please rely on your public librarians. They love helping people, and this is a great way to get articles. Another thing is ask on social media. One of your friends may have already accessed this articles and might say, oh yeah, I have that. I'll send it to you. You might know people who work in university systems who have access to a lot of things. Maybe they're a student, maybe they're a professor, or they know people. I actually get a lot of access to stuff because I have a friend who works for a university and she gave me her password. Don't tell anyone. But that's how I get things. So sometimes I'll see something pop up on social media saying, hey, I've been trying to get this article. I can't get a copy. And I will go into my systems, see if I could get it and offer to send it to them. So definitely ask that. Another thing is contact the author. I'm sure Ross will tell you, people who write articles want to know that their articles are being read. And if you contact them and say, hey, I read your abstract. This sounds really fascinating. I would love to see the whole article. They will be thrilled to send it to you. The way to find their information, usually an article will have, it might have the person's email address, or it might have a link to them. Of course, people do move around. So if it's not within the last few years, it's possible that they have moved on to a different workplace. So you might get a bounce back from the email. Go ahead and Google them and see if you can find what university they are now working at, or maybe they've gone to private practice, whatever they're doing. You might be able to find a contact information and go ahead and ask them. Like I said, they're going to be really flattered. Another thing is just email me. I can't get absolutely everything, but I can get quite a lot. So please reach out to me and say, hey, I've been trying to get access to this article. Can you help me? I'm very happy to do that. And I try to respond very quickly. And I'm also, frankly, quite interested in seeing what other people are reading. And it's possible that it's going to be an article that I haven't seen myself. And I'll say, oh, great. Thank you so much for letting me know that this article exists. So I think that's it for me. Okay, yes, back to Ross.
Thank you, Millie. Okay, just a few comments and tips on evaluating research. How do you tell whether this is a study that you should pay attention to? I can offer a few tips. In general, good articles are published in good journals. And one of the ways that we can tell what's a good journal is in terms of what they call an impact factor. So journals have ratings in terms of how frequently they're cited. It's takes into account a lot of information about journals. But if you get on Google and you want to know the impact factor of, let's say, the International Journal of Eating Disorders, if you type that in, it's going to pop up a number. In general, journals that have impact factors of 1 or 2 are generally considered to be pretty low, not high quality journals. There's still some good research in there. But journals that start to hit around a 4 to a 5 are generally, particularly for our field of eating disorders, considered to be relatively good articles. And so if you're trying to find research, pay attention to where that the articles are published, and pay attention to the impact factors. And I've got a few recommendations. First, in terms of eating disorder journals, there are 3 that stand out in no particular order. I think they're all very close in terms of impact factor, right around 5. The European Eating Disorders Review, I think Beata Herpertz-Dahlmann is the editor of that journal. Journal of Eating Disorders, it's an online Australian journal. Editors are Stephen Taus and Philippa Hay. And the International Journal of Eating Disorders, which is the longest standing eating disorder journal. The editors, Ruth Weissman, all are considered to be top-notch eating disorder specialty journals. And so I'm not saying that every article in there is great quality, but I will say that in general, these eating disorder specialty journals will have the best eating disorder articles. So that's 3 recommendations there. In terms of psychology journals, here are a few quality psychology journals that tend to publish eating disorder articles. Clinical Psychological Science, a relatively new, it's been around maybe the last 6 or 7 years. It's a high quality journal. Health Psychology, Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology is one of the premier clinically oriented psychology journals. To get an article published in there is somewhat of a feat because it's hard to get articles in there. The journal formerly known as Journal of Normal Psychology, who very recently changed their name to Journal of Psychopathology and Clinical Science, that's also a top-notch journal. And again, an eating disorder publication in there is sort of a big deal. And Psychological Medicine, a variety of different articles. We've got treatment articles in there. We've got theoretical articles. Again, it's top quality journals. All these have impact factors of 5 or more. So pay attention to those. Specialty journals that publish eating disorder research, there's a lot of them, but here's a few recommendations of good ones. Appetite, Annals of Behavioral Medicine, Body Image, Journal of Adolescent Health, and Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics, which has just a crazy impact factor. It doesn't publish a lot of eating disorder articles, but a few of them that are just top notch. So pay attention to where articles are published. In general, better articles will be in these types of journals with higher impact factors. Other things to pay attention to, if you're looking at a specific article, frequently cited articles. So when Millie had up that image of Google citations, it listed specific articles and then it said cited by 2 others. Articles that are frequently cited 10 or more times, 20 or more times, are articles that researchers consider to be important, so pay attention to that. I mentioned before the type of studies, meta-analyses, randomized clinical trials, reviews are all important to pay attention to. And NIH-funded research. So if you get an article, typically somewhere in the footnotes, there's going to be this study was funded by, and it's going to list the funding sources. National Institute of Health funded research is a review system where it's very difficult to get money. One has to submit for grant applications and go through a very rigorous process. So NIH funded research is typically vetted. It's considered to be top-notch research. So you're likely to have articles that reflect better quality of research done when it's NIH funded. And that goes with other funding sources as well, like National Science Foundation and others. Generally funded research tends to be better quality. I think that's it in terms of our slides. If you've got further questions, our emails are here. Please, I think Dawn is going to distribute copies of our slides. Use them in any way that you see fit. If you've got questions, we're happy to address those now. Or if you've got later questions, we'd be happy to address them by email. But I will stop sharing and open the floor up for questions.
Okay, we do have a few questions. So I'm going to start with one. As a parent caregiver of a teen with an eating disorder, I frequently hear FBT hailed as the gold standard and the only best evidence treatment for eating disorders. I would love to hear thoughts from both of you about how to objectively assess what the actual success rates for FBT might be.
In terms of evidence base, there's one thing that I would suggest if people are interested in trying to find out what is the evidence for a particular treatment. The NICE guidelines are guidelines. I think they're published in Europe, Millie, if I'm not right.
Yes, the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and what they do is they will review different treatments and provide grades in terms of an A quality for a particular type of eating disorder, B quality, and they will summarize the evidence there. So I think neither Millie nor myself are experts in terms of FBT. So I would hate to make comments about that, but I would suggest that you go to the NICE guidelines and they will provide a nice summary of what the available evidence for FBT is. Anything you want to add to that, Millie?
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Other than that, looking for one of these, either a meta-analysis or a systematic review of treatments, where it will lay out the information of FBT versus other ones. And of course, with any of this, it depends on individuals. So they can give the scientific research, but you know your family and what may or may not work.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. I do read a lot of research. I really struggle with it because I'm not an academic or a professional or a medical professional. But I do think it's really important for parents to stay current and to know, what the research says. And a lot of times I see a lot of different study sizes. And I was wondering, in terms of study size, like sometimes I'll see a very small number and I'll think to myself, well, how valuable is that research if the study size, was a very low double digits? So is there like a standard study size that's considered to be more, I don't know, like a qualitative, I guess I would say, or how does study size factor into research?
So I can start out with an answer, and I'm hoping Millie might add to this. In terms of treatment research, when, for example, randomized controlled trials, typically the sample size is set by what statisticians would call a power analysis. So we figure out what is the sample size that we need to have an appropriate chance of identifying a treatment that's more effective than another treatment. And so most of the randomized controlled trials will report their power analysis and report how they got to a specific sample size. In treatment research, if it were a 2-group arm and it's adequately powered, it's going to be somewhere in the range of at least 50 to 60 participants per group, and perhaps more than that. So for treatment studies, a total sample size of 100 to 120 would be considered adequate sample size. Studies that are smaller than that would consider to be more pilot studies, preliminary type studies. It's not that they don't provide valuable information, but they're not as high quality of research as some of the larger studies.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. Those numbers all make sense to me. And when someone is starting to research something new, they're going to start with a small group, see if they get anything that makes sense, and then start moving on to larger groups and maybe doing multiple sites if they're able to do that, so that they're not just looking at patients in one particular treatment center. They may reach out and then try to work with other groups or academic groups who do this to keep getting larger and larger samples, but it can be a process.
Yeah, that's a great point, Millie.
I have another question. How do you make sure that there's no bias in research? Like, how do you make sure that, you're not somehow manipulating? And I'm not accusing anyone of doing it. I'm asking a serious question. Because I always wonder, like, as a researcher, do you have kind of like this predetermined, like, you obviously are doing research because you think that, you know what the results are going to be. So how do you make sure that your research isn't biased, and that your, preconceived notions don't impact the quality of the research?
Again, it's a great question, and it depends upon the kind of study that you're running. So the randomized controlled studies that I've talked about are designed specifically to minimize the amount of bias. It tends to equate the groups, and so that which treatment they receive is unrelated to any of their characteristics, thereby removing any potential bias. But a lot of the research we do does not have randomization involved. Oftentimes we're studying intact groups, and obviously in those circumstances there's a lot more opportunity for bias and potentially confounding variables. Typically as researchers, what we'll try to do is say, what are those variables that potentially could confound the research? So for example, if we're comparing groups, are the groups different in terms of age or socioeconomic status or eating disorder diagnosis? And will those variables confound our results? So the first step would be trying to identify what potential sources of bias there are. And then there are techniques that we can use to minimize the bias. I wouldn't say remove the bias. So for example, if we think that age and socioeconomic status are potential confounders, we could match our groups on those variables. we could control for those statistically using covariates. None of those solutions are perfect, but at least it's an attempt to try to minimize the biases associated. So my basic answer is I think all research has some confounding and bias in it. And it's important that the researchers and the people that are reading the articles be aware of those potential factors and do the best that they can to try to minimize those. Then when it gets to the interpretation phase, it's really important when you're interpreting results that you take into account what things may have contributed to the bias or confounding in the study. So one of the sections that we always write in papers is limitations to this research. And it's incumbent upon the researchers to identify what biases there may be in their studies and what the limitations of interpreting the study and the results are.
Yeah, I agree. Looking at that limitation section can be very useful because people do, they're trying to be honest about what they're doing. Also, look at the population being studied. If they are only using, say, college students, then maybe those results don't necessarily mean the same thing for a group of middle-aged people, for instance, or young teens. So it's good to look at whether this is looking at the population for the particular person that your loved one is, or whatever you're looking at. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong and it doesn't fit at all. It's just something to keep in mind.
Okay, next question. Any thoughts about the limitations of achieving high quality RCT level research results for eating disorder treatment outcomes due to the highly individualized presentations of eating disorders and the many confounding factors in treatment delivery?
Yeah, there's a lot there.
You want to start, Millie?
One thing, I guess this kind of relates, that I often think about is if they're doing an outcome and they say, this is our 1-year outcome after people got out of treatment, what people have done after that could be wildly varied. Someone might be going home to one of your families who are highly supportive. Some other people are going home to families that are not supportive and might set them back in their treatment. Some people have a therapist who is highly specialized in eating disorders and some don't. So there are so many different confounding factors there to consider. Yeah, everyone is individuals. People react to treatment differently. So we are trying to group together those people. And Ross can probably say a little bit more about that.
So randomized controlled trials are really good at being able to control the influence of certain biases and confounds, but they're really almost done in a vacuum. We set very strict criteria for entry into the studies. We have oftentimes it's conducted in research offices and not in real life settings. So an RCT would be what we would call an efficacy study, where it's in a very isolated environment and a particular effect is shown. One of the problems with RCTs and efficacy research is that oftentimes they don't translate real well to the real world. So when you take the findings from an initial RCT and try to apply them at a clinic, for example, oftentimes in that natural setting where a much broader range of patients, there's no exclusion criteria, you don't have randomized treatments that can control factors, suddenly you get in a real world situation, what we call effectiveness research rather than efficacy. And oftentimes those RCT results don't generalize to the real world as nicely as we want them to. It's sort of trying to weigh two different parts, a really perfect study and a real world study. And oftentimes there's not a great connection between the two.
And I think this is something that the field is very much looking at because we know that this is an issue. And there are a lot of people who are trying to figure out how to bring things from the lab into real life and make sure that all of you who are getting treatment from the therapist who you work with, as opposed to a lab, are going to get the best treatment possible.
Thank you. I have one final question that's my own, and it's something that really bothers me. Why are people with lived experience not involved in research, design, and execution to a larger degree? It feels like we are left out of research. And I really wonder why. I feel like people with lived experience, either personally or, us as parents, have so much insight, into all these topics related to eating disorders. And I just always wonder sometimes when I'm reading these research articles, why was lived experience not included in this research study? So I was just wondering why you think it is that lived experience really is so underutilized.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would absolutely agree with you. I'm not sure that I have the answer as to why, but I do totally agree that it's got very limited applicability in the scientific models that we currently have. It's, our research group is a good example where scientists sit around the table and plan things out, and there's not much discussion in terms of trying to rely on the experience of people with lived experience to inform our studies. It's definitely a limitation of the research that we do.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very slowly getting better because of voices like yours, Judy, and other people who have spoken up and said, hey, what about us? Our voice is important. And I think some people, definitely not everyone, but some people are starting to listen and say, yeah, this is important. I know there are getting to be more articles that are sort of interview studies of asking people their experience in treatment, which doesn't solve the problem that you mentioned of personal experience being part of setting up the study in the first place. I like to think that I do that a little bit for ERC because I'm on the research committee and I am someone with lived experience. I try to speak up about it when I can. But it's a slow process. And I think the more that you and others say, hey, my voice matters in this, that people will listen. But I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's very important to talk about.
I would absolutely agree.
Well, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time. So I want to say a tremendous thank you to both of you. This was really super interesting and a topic that we really don't, get into that often. So it was really a treat for us. And I would just like to encourage everyone here who was at the webinar today. F.E.A.S.T is funded solely on the generosity of the community. And the only way that we can continue to offer free programming is through donations. So if you like today's webinar, if you benefited, if you have the means to donate to F.E.A.S.T, we would really appreciate any donation that you can offer. And we'd love to see you at our next 2 webinars. The next one is on May 3rd, which is pretty soon, Understanding ARFID and its Genetic and Environmental Causes. And the one after that, which is in June, is Relapse and Eating Disorders, Navigating the Challenges and Supporting Recovery. Both promise to be amazing webinars. We hope to see you then. Again, thank you so much, Ross and Millie. This was amazing, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks for the invite.
Bye.